2023 National Youth Summit on Democracy. We're so glad that you're joining us today. My name is Carrie Heflin, and I am your host from the National Museum of American History. We'd like to start by giving you a little bit of background about the National Youth Summit program. This year's National Youth Summit has consisted of a series of case studies for middle and high school students tackling the big question, how do the stories we tell about the past shape our democracy? They've helped us look at how groups and individuals have provided examples of civic engagement that goes beyond just voting, and they invite you to examine history as a tool for understanding our present and shaping our shared future. The 3 case studies for this year focused on a different topic and supporting question, but they all provided a similar structure for investigation, analysis, discussion, and reflection. If you're joining us live today, we're happy to have you. And if you're watching this as a recording, we're so glad you found this resource. We're going to take a quick look together at our agenda for today. As you'll see on the screen, we're starting today with our welcome and a keynote speaker, Ebony McKeever from the OER project. This will be followed by sessions 1 through 3. And that takes us up until 3:25. If you'd like, you can also follow along with the Learning Lab collection that goes along with the National Youth Summit for today. You can find that on learninglab.si.edu. And just as a quick note, if you are streaming on the National Youth Summit webpage, you won't be able to see the chat. So if you want to share your thoughts with us, please go to Facebook or our YouTube channel to stream, or you can always email us at historyteachers@si.edu. So it's now my honor to introduce Ebony McKeever, our keynote speaker for today. Ebony is currently the Senior Engagement Manager with the OER project. The OER project seeks to empower teachers, especially in world history, to better serve their students through innovative curricula and a variety of teaching tools. With 20 years of experience in the field of education, Ebony has served previously as the Social Studies State Specialist for the state of Nebraska and secondary social studies educator in Cleveland, Ohio, Baltimore, Maryland, and Omaha, Nebraska. The scope of Ebony's work includes analyzing both current and existing trends with regard to social studies curriculum and instructional materials to create optimal learning and environments for both educators and students, developing and leading professional development, identifying and communicating instructional shifts, providing content and technical expertise in social studies to education professionals throughout the country, and guiding school districts through the instructional materials selection process. Ebony brings to her current role a strong commitment to uplifting underrepresented and marginalized populations, social justice, and advocacy. She is intentional in her work to engage educators about and promote high-quality instructional materials in social studies that emphasizes inquiry and diversity. Welcome, Ebony. We're so happy to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me. Just a moment as I share my presentation. I can't find it. I have a million tabs open, so we won't worry about that. We'll go right into what I'd like to discuss with you all today. So much of what we understand about democracy has grown from ancient Greece and specifically the Athenians. Democracy is a combination of 2 Greek words, demos, meaning all citizens, and kratos, meaning rule. I want you to imagine that instead of being in front of your computer or in your classroom, you instead are in ancient Greece. This morning, after you woke up and prepared for the day, you walk to the hilltop in Athens, where an amphitheater is located, and you join other members of the assembly. You take your seat, and the announcer opens the meeting by asking if any of the people in attendance would like to address the assembly. Someone stands to talk about a public festival, another stands to discuss taxes. If they are a citizen, anyone in that room is allowed to discuss and speak any issue that concerns them. After the speaker is finished, the council lays out the issues concerning Sparta. Should we go to war with the Spartans or not? At the end of much discussion, a vote is taken. You raise your hand when it comes to should we go to war with Sparta or not, and you vote no. Now take 1 second to think about that. As a citizen of Athens, it is part of your responsibility to decide whether or not you should go to war. My bigger point in all of this is that no matter your social class or your age, as long as you were a citizen of Athens, your voice was heard and your vote was counted. Now, I'm not saying democracy in ancient Greece was perfect. Women were not allowed to participate, and neither were non-Athenians. But the overall message is that no matter who the person, you are no more important than the person next to you. Citizens of Greece showed up because they understood that their voice mattered, that they mattered. Here in the United States in 2023, our version of democracy operates a little differently. We are a representative democracy first, which means we elect people who represent us in the legislative and executive branches of the government. The second is we have this thing called the Electoral College. Each state is given a certain number of electors based on the population. When you cast your vote, you're actually casting your vote to tell the electors who they should choose for president. The electors are supposed to represent the will of the people from the state that they represent. And it is possible that people feel, because of the Electoral College and the idea of representative democracy, that they are not included or not represented as they should be in our government. There are a couple of examples that our Constitution has for that. The first is the 13th Amendment that was ratified in December of 1865. It was the first of our 3 Reconstruction amendments. It provided Black men with the right to vote. That, however, came with restrictions, including poll taxes and the grandfather clause. In other words, if you were a Black man, you were not allowed to vote unless you paid an extremely high fee or your grandfather had voted in a previous election. If you were a former enslaved person, the likelihood that your grandfather had voted was almost zero. Our 19th Amendment. For 55 years, arguments were made, between 1865 and 1920, arguments were made that women were too emotional, they could not possibly make logical decisions when it came to politics, and that a man casting his vote was a vote for the entire household. A woman's case for elections was best made to her husband. And finally, in 1920, women gained the right to vote. Before 1971, the voting age for Americans was 21. That all changed with the 26th Amendment. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. One of the major arguments for why the voting age should be lowered was that you could be drafted and forced to fight in a war for our country, but you were unable to cast a vote to decide on the person who could send you there. Currently, in some states, we have convicted felon laws. And even after someone who has been convicted of a felony and they've served their time, they are unable to vote in elections. States like Minnesota and North Carolina are currently arguing over whether or not to expand voting rights. But I'm here to tell you, while feelings of anti-mattering are real, non-dominant groups have always made their voice heard to shape democracy, which is why the stories we tell become so important. like the stories associated with the case studies for this year's National Youth Summit on Democracy. First, the longest walk. When we talk about the civil rights movement, who are we generally talking about? We discuss people like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and other people who have played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement. And I'm not saying that we should not discuss them. But did you know at the same time, there were other civil rights movements happening among other marginalized groups? The Chicano movement, women's rights, LGBTQ, and the Native American movements were all happening at the same time. What is important about the journey of the longest walk in 1978 is that several Native American groups were organized in advocating for the rights and welfare of our tribal communities across the country. None of this work happened in silos. And in that year, none of the bills that were targeted towards Native American or indigenous tribes passed Congress. The AIDS quilt. When it went on display for the first time in October of 1987, the AIDS quilt had 1,920 panels. I want you to think of the power of an image and how it has in shaping the stories of our democracy. Clearly, the people who had passed of AIDS and those living with it deserve to know that their voices and lives were important to the collective of our nation's story. Perhaps even more impactful is that the quilt tells a story that AIDS didn't just affect the LGBTQ community, but it touched the lives of many Americans from many different walks of life. Since its first display in 1987, there have been about 50,000 panels that have been created for the quilt and dedicated to more than 110,000 people. More than 15 million people have viewed the quilt, raising awareness of AIDS. Democracy just isn't the passage of laws, but it also looks at initiatives, organizations, and understanding. And last, no more Manzanars. There is power in not only the story of the Manzanar Japanese internment camp, but also in how individuals have come together to ensure nothing like this will ever happen again. Think about the things you or your family have experienced in the past. Those things that contribute to the identity of who you are, but you also hope that no one else has to experience or go through those things. For me, very easy, racism. More specifically, racism experienced by students of color and from marginalized populations in school. Growing up, I had a teacher who would say awful things and treated me differently solely on the basis of my skin color. So I grew up, I became an educator to reverse that treatment and to make sure that every student that I came in contact with felt cared for and respected by me. So my question to everyone listening is, what are you doing to make sure that some of the events that happened to you or to your family in the past do not repeat themselves? The Manzanar Committee not only organizes a yearly pilgrimage with speakers and cultural performances, but they were also instrumental in the work to preserve historical sites and the passage of federal legislation for redress and reparations in 1988. These are all examples of how the collective voices of many people who are determined to show folks that they matter and can make a difference. Many of you have spent the last 5 months participating in this National Youth Summit. But now what? What is your role going forward? So first, tell the stories of the past. But when you tell them, make sure that you include the agency of the non-dominant groups who are a part of those stories. The events in history didn't just happen to marginalized groups. Each group had its own agency, and many fought hard to let the world know that they not only existed, but that they mattered. The Emancipation Proclamation is an example of that. There are lots of people who say Lincoln freed the slave. All argue that the enslaved freed themselves. Some escape from those who enslaved them to tell the stories and create a case for why slavery should be abolished. Black men joined the Union Army in the fight because they understood what was at stake. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed person in the world during the 1800s. He knew that by constantly being photographed, he could convince people that Blacks were dignified and worthy of respect. Freedom isn't bestowed or given to a group of people. We are all born with the right to be free. Also, your role is to tell the stories of those who cannot tell it for themselves, just not those who have passed and gone to be with the ancestors. I'm sure we all know someone that doesn't think what they have to say or what they have gone through matters, but you know differently. Part of the way that we can show others that they matter is by giving a voice to their stories. Now, the last role, the last thing that you can do is tell your own story. The thing is, wherever I was in life and whoever I encountered, I made sure to tell my story. And I told my story over and over and over again until someone would listen. Then 2 people listened, 3 people listened, and enough people listened that my audience grew. But I also want to be very clear with you all today. The most important audience that I have ever had in my life besides you all is the audience of my students. Why? Because through my own story, I was able to motivate hundreds of young people to tell their own stories, inspire them to action, and inspire them to express democracy in the ways in which they identified. Today, I am proud to see them out there demonstrating that they matter. Remember the story I told you about voting in ancient Greece and how it happened. You don't have to be famous for the stories you tell to help shape democracy. You just have to be willing to show up, raise your hand, and be counted. And before I end today, I would like to pay my honors and respects to Harry Belafonte, who passed away today. As we talk about democracy and identity, he was someone who was at the forefront of making sure to always use his identity to fight and help shape democracy in the United States. Thank you all so much for tuning in and listening, and I'm excited for what the rest of the afternoon has to hold. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ebony. We're so grateful that you could come and share your time and your thoughts and some of your own story with us today. And as I was listening to you talk, I was thinking about how at the National Museum of American History, we discuss often the long arc of democracy in this world and the many ebbs and flows and expansions and contractions of democratic rights that people have experienced across time and place. And that's one of the reasons that we believe that no matter where you find yourself in that cycle and expansions or contractions, it's important to share stories about the past and about how people have found themselves in time and place and taken agency and power um, to shape the future of democracy. And so we're going to look at some case studies together today that help us think about just that and help us think about our own place in our current democratic climate and the actions that we want to take as participants in that democracy. So let's take a quick look at our agenda moving forward. We just finished our welcome and our keynote speaker. Next, we'll be headed into session 1, which is the case study about the AIDS Memorial Quilt. That's going to start at 2 o'clock. So we have a 10-minute break coming up. We'll go ahead and send you all off to rest, reflect on the keynote, and get ready for session 1. Please feel free to bring something to jot down your thoughts and take notes on. But other than that, all we need you to bring is yourself. We'll see you back at 2 o'clock. Thank you all.
Hello, and welcome back to our next session, which is going to focus on the AIDS Memorial Quilt of the 1980s. And so we are going to take a deeper dive into that. But before we do, just wanted to do some brief introductions. Eden, it is so nice to be back on screen with you. This is our fourth webinar together in this series. So could you briefly introduce yourself and just a little bit about your role at the museum?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's good to be back. My name is Eden, and I'm an educator at the National Museum of American History. My role at the museum is sort of two-part. I help create some of the educational resources that the museum offers, but I also maintain and manage some of the educational websites that house them. So shameless plug, go check out History Explorer and Becoming Us. You can just Google them, as well as the National Youth Summit webpage.
Thank you so much. And I am Megan Linehan. I'm an education specialist also at the National Museum of American History. I work very closely with Eden on the Youth Summit program. And so my work is mainly focused on middle school and high school students, as well as thinking about, as a museum, how can we support teachers and students in their civic engagement journey. So with that, let's dive in. All right, so our next slide. We have a quick question for our audience, and in order to answer this question, you can either scan the QR code that is on the screen, or you can go to menti, MENTI.com, and it'll prompt you to enter that code. Knocking things over here. And so please go to the site and respond to the question. What are 3 words that come to mind when you think of a national health crisis? So we're going to give about 30 seconds for people to log in and share 3 words that pop into their heads. Okay, we're getting some responses in here. The word that jumps out at me, Eden, is scary, mostly because that's the biggest one. But is there a word here that jumps out for you as well?
Megan, is it possible to zoom in, or
I can try. You know what? Let's do it that way. There we go. Thank you.
Oh wow, really good words. Chaos, vaccines, broken system, inequity. I think inequity is a really good word for maybe the topic of what we'll be talking about today. I mean,
Yeah,
all of these words, though.
Yeah, I'm glad you highlighted the word inequity, because as we'll talk about, when we experience national health emergencies, we often see marginalized communities impacted the hardest. And so, Eden, if you could, would you mind sharing a little bit about the historical background on the AIDS epidemic and the quilt itself?
Of course. This, of course, is a very brief historical background. If you would like to learn more, we do have a full program that we did with a museum curator, Catherine Ott, and that webcast is on the National Youth Summit webpage. So AIDS was first identified in the United States in the 80s when young, previously healthy gay men started falling ill. We now know more about AIDS, like how it spread and also the advancements that have been made in treatment options. But at the time, there was little attention from the federal government and the media. When there was attention given, it was unfortunately often serious discrimination. I mean, people lost homes, jobs, health insurance, all because of the stigma associated with it. And due to that stigma and slow government response, it fell on the communities to step in and fill in those gaps. We saw grassroots organizations and the LGBTQ community. They educated people, they raised awareness, advocated for research funding, protested for compassionate patient care and resources like testing and counseling. And they also coordinated political pressure. But what we'll be talking about today specifically is the AIDS Memorial Quilt. In the late 80s, a group of activists and volunteers created the AIDS Memorial Quilt as a method of political art, a method of education and advocacy, a way to humanize the disease, and simply just to express their grief. The quilt is made up of thousands of individual panels, which you'll see in the picture, and each one bearing the name of a person who died of AIDS. Originally, when it was first displayed in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall, there were 1,920 panels. Now there are around 50,000 panels dedicated to more than 100,000 people that are now, and those panels are now digitized. And out of so many, we've chosen one for us to analyze today.
Thank you, Eden, for providing that context for us. So on the screen, we should see a panel. I'll make that a little bit bigger here. So to start off with the routine, the thinking routine we're going to do today, which is called Lenses for Dialogue, we are going to start by making some observations. And so Eden and I are going to rally robin. We're going to go back and forth, kind of like we're in a tennis match, with some of the things that we see on this quilt panel. And then we'll dive into some deeper questions to help us unpack what's happening in this panel. And apologies if you hear a cat meowing. She just woke up. All right, so let's go back to our quilt panel. All right, so we're just going to take about 30 seconds. And so Eden, do you want to start us off with something you observe on the panel?
Sure. I see an upside down pink triangle, and I admit, because I have talked to Catherine Ott in our previous webcast, I do know that this is an important symbol.
Okay. I'm noticing a lot of the color red, both in the letters and the words, but also in that ribbon in the middle of that pink triangle. And I think at this point in time, that red ribbon is a very prominent symbol of HIV and AIDS awareness and education efforts. Back to you.
I see the logo for MTV, which I did not have growing up, but I know that it's a network, I believe. And around it is The Real World, which I believe was a television show on MTV.
Yes, I will age myself and share more about that in a little bit. And then, I mean, we have the writing says AIDS is a disease of the human face. And then right under that, there is a picture of this young man. I mean, he looks very young. We also have the name Pedro Zamora. So I'm going to go ahead and guess that this panel is dedicated to Pedro Zamora and that this is his picture here.
And I think if you zoom in to the top right corner, it looks like there's some writing on a rectangle. It looks like a list. And I think I can make out the words 20 ways you can't get AIDS.
That is correct. All right, so we've made a bunch of observations. And so now we are going to unpack that a little bit with this lenses dialogue. And so let me go back to our questions here. All right, so Eden, do you want to ask me the first question?
Yes. So here at our pre-K to 12 team, we're big fans of Harvard University's project Zero Thinking Routines. And one of those thinking routines is called Lenses for Dialogue. So step 1, you choose and share a lens. Step 2, you probe a little bit deeper. And then step 3, reflection. So sharing a lens, Megan, think a little bit about how you see the world. It could be maybe the way that you grew up, maybe the race and ethnicity that you identify yourself as, the gender you identify yourself as. Can you choose one lens and think about how you see or think about the quilt panel through those lenses?
Sure. This is my opportunity to date myself and say that I grew up in the 1980s and 1990s. So I would have been 11 years old around the time when this man Pedro was on the MTV show The Real World. Now, we did have MTV. My parents did not want me to watch it, and therefore it was all the cooler because it was a thing that was forbidden. And so when I'm thinking about this quilt panel, I'm thinking about the seasons of The Real World, which was a reality TV show where a bunch of strangers lived together in a house. And I'm just thinking about my experience with that, how The Real World and MTV was always like a conversation point for me and my friends, like, did you see this? What was happening? And, it was a way to kind of expose me as a suburban kid to different walks of life and different people's experiences. So that's the lens I would choose.
Can you say more about walks of life? Because you mentioned you grew up in a suburban neighborhood. So how did that, what do you mean by it exposed you to people from different life?
Yeah, so I grew up in a suburb of Buffalo, New York. It was a pretty insular town. Just most people were the same religion. We all went to the same high school. There wasn't a ton of diversity at my school. So again, it was just a way to see the way other people live, to hear different perspectives from people that maybe I wouldn't have had an opportunity to talk to face to face. And it also just, I would say, ignited my curiosity, both about the people who were represented on the show, but then also each season of The Real World took place in a different city. So it also was a great way to kind of like vicariously travel around the country and see, what was happening in those different areas. Yeah.
All right, so we've observed the panel, we've chosen the lens and thought more about the panel. Any other questions that came up for you? Any other observations?
Well, as we were talking about it, I was kind of thinking a little bit about how MTV was that major platform. People weren't on we didn't have smartphones back then. We weren't using Instagram or, all these other platforms. And so, MTV was one of those mediums. The television, MTV as a channel was one of those mediums that kind of expanded your network. And so I guess I'm just thinking about how it would be different today. MTV, I think, does not play the same cultural role as it once did. But so what has taken its place? Seems like maybe places like TikTok, Instagram, other social media platforms might be those places where people are being exposed to different experiences, different perspectives. And so, yeah, so I'm not an expert in that. I'm also no longer a young person, but those are some of the things that I'm thinking about as I reflect on this. So I would love to go back, and now that we've done this routine, is it okay if I go back and just share a little bit about Pedro and his story?
Yes, tell me more about The Real World.
So Pedro Zamora was on the season of Real World San Francisco that aired in 1994 on MTV. And this would have been after the worst of the AIDS crisis, but this was still very much an issue. And so you will notice we observed that he was a very young man. He was, in fact, about 22 years old when he went on this show. And he was a young Cuban American who was living with HIV at the time. And so he was actually invited on by one of the producers of the show, who was also a gay man and had experienced losing many of his friends as a young person in the 80s. And so even at this point, it took a lot of courage to go on national television and A, be openly gay, and B, be openly talk about your HIV positive status. But he did that. And so it was very brave of him, and he used his platform to educate and draw attention to this ongoing crisis. And by being on TV, he helped to personalize and humanize the disease, especially for a lot of young people who may have thought, like, this can't happen to me. And one other notable thing about him was that he married his partner on live TV. And that is actually the first instance of a gay commitment ceremony that happened. So that was pretty cool. That being said, unfortunately, he died shortly after he was on the show. He was 22 when he died. And again, he put a face on and humanized the disease in all of its stages. And he did so very bravely. So that's Pedro Zamora. And this is one of his panels. He has multiple panels, and I encourage you to search his name on the interactive link and find the other ones that are dedicated to him and dedicated to other people as well. Right, so that is about Pedro, and let me skip ahead because I have some questions for you now, Eden. This first question is, how do the different designs, messages, and personal touches on the quilt panels serve to humanize those who have died from AIDS?
Well, I think that by putting a face and name to someone impacted by AIDS, we're able to humanize the disease and get to know more about the people who are impacted by it. And I mean, in the example of Pedro, we know from the one panel that we saw, he was passionate about advocacy and education. I really did come into this not knowing anything about Pedro or the real world. Which is also telling of my age and maybe how I grew up. But knowing that the panel was created after his death by his friends and family, we know that he was loved and that he was cared for. We know that AIDS really impacted many people from all walks of life. There was no discrimination when it came to the disease. And I just love that there are so many individual panels of the quilt, so we get to learn about each human. But then we see some of the quilts being brought together, and we're able to see this huge loving community. And just because we are running a little bit short on time, I'm going to move on to the next question, because I think the second question is just as important, about how we mark important events and people. I originally studied art history. That's how I came into this museum world. And so I know that usually memorials and statues are often created by one, two, maybe a few people. They're usually professionals in some capacity, whether they have an art background, whether they have experience in some of the materials that they're using. I think what's so special about the AIDS Memorial Quilt is that it was created by a community, and it was created by anyone, by non-professionals. They're easily movable. They're You can travel with them. It's cold in my home right now, so I have a blanket on my lap, and I just think like this is something that offers me comfort and safety and protection. And so I love the symbolism that this quilt has, that these quilts have. So Megan, we started with the first Mentimeter question. We obviously know that the AIDS epidemic wasn't the first national health crisis our country experienced. And unfortunately, it may not be the last. So we want to close the session by asking everyone to think ahead to a future possible national health crisis, and think, how will we respond? In moments when we are scared, when we just don't have a lot of information, what can we do to bridge our differences? So we did this this process at the beginning of the session. We're ending it the same way. There's a QR code for you to scan using your phone. Or again, you can go to menti.com and enter the code and answer the question. And we will give just a few seconds, maybe a minute, just so that we stay on track, timing-wise.
Okay, we're getting some answers in. Compassion is coming up a lot. So remembering, looking to what we have in common and feeling that empathy for another, knowing that we all are feeling similar emotions, that that fear and the uncertainty, looking to your neighbors. So again, finding the local aspect of it. Yes, it might be happening on a national scale, but where can you make a small difference? Lots of small acts can lead to big change. I love these. Okay, so just to keep us on time, please keep answering. If you have more ideas to share, we will definitely look at those, and we'd love to hear from you. But to keep us moving, let me switch back to our presentation. Also, as a fun aside, my mom must be watching because she just texted me to say I must have had really mean parents growing up because they didn't let me watch MTV.
Listen, I didn't get cable at all, so your parents were an angel compared to mine.
All right, so I'm just gonna take a quick look in the chat. I don't see any questions at this point, but if you do have a question that comes up, you can throw it in the chat at any point today, and we'll try to follow up with you. We thank you so much for joining us and engaging in the session. We loved hearing from you in our Mentimeter polls. You can always find more resources at the National Youth Summit webpage, which is being linked into the chat for you. That's where you will find the case study with more information and museum resources on the AIDS crisis and the AIDS Memorial Quilt, along with that webinar with a curator that Eden referenced earlier. And I'm gonna send you off with a plug for our next session, which will start promptly at 2:30, so in about 5 minutes. That one is gonna look at No More Manzanars, which references Japanese incarceration during World War II and their campaign for redress in the 1980s. So we hope that you will stick around and join us for that session. But in the next 5 minutes, 4 minutes now, please feel free to stand up, take a break, stretch your legs, whatever you need to do. We will see you back here at 2:30 on the dot. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being with us today. Over the past hour or so, it was wonderful to hear from Ebony at the outset, her thoughts and some ideas on how one can be involved in our community and our democratic processes. And it was wonderful to learn about the eighth quilt. Thank you, Megan and Eden, for leading us through that conversation. We're going to talk a little bit now about No More Manzanar. This is the second of 3 case studies that are part of this year's civic education series. As Megan pointed out, they are all available on our website. If you follow the link for the eighth quilt, you will inevitably find all of the other case studies as well. But we will share some more links at the end of our time together. Before we get started, we're going to introduce ourselves. Sylvia, may you please share a little about who you are, what brought you to NMH, and what it is that you do?
Well, my name is Rossi. I am an intern at the Museum of National American History. I am working with both the educational area and the curatorial area of the museum, and I have been doing this internship for about a year now.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. And my name is Orlando Serrano. I manage the youth and teacher programs at the National Museum of American History. I get to work with all the folks who you have met today. And a lot of what our work entails, the way I translate our work for folks who ask, is that it is our job to figure out ways to make our collections, both the ones that are on the floor and the exhibits that you see, and the ones that are behind doors and storage and in drawers, how we make all those collections not just accessible but usable by K-12 audiences and the adults who get to be in the lives of those young people supporting them. I've been doing this work now for about 5 years. Prior to that, I was a high school English teacher in Washington, D.C. And as I always share with folks, teaching and teachers and students are my favorite audiences. And again, thank you for being with us either live or later on joining us asynchronously. All right, so let's get started. We've got a few minutes to think and learn a little bit about what we mean when we say no more Manzanars. And as Eden pointed out earlier, we use Project Zero thinking routines to help guide our thinking, to help us think through and analyze material, culture, primary sources when we encounter it. They're great strategies to use with objects, with artifacts, with all kinds of primary sources. So we're going to introduce another one now, and it's called 3-2-1 Bridge. All right, and Sylvia will be my thinking partner throughout this, and when she leads some ideas, I will be her thinking partner. If you have any comments, please feel free to put them in the chat, but you'll get to see how this works by seeing us modeling it with one another. The way I describe 3-2-1 Bridge for folks who maybe are not familiar with it is that it's a little bit of a deeper thinking version of a KWL chart. If your teachers out there, if your students out there, you've done one of these. K, what do you know? W, what do you want to know? And then at the end, what did you learn? KWL. We're going to use 3-2-1 Bridge. And I'm going to ask Sylvia to think a little bit here. The larger topic around No More Manzanars is Japanese American incarceration during World War II, right? That is the historical context in which this sits. So, Sylvia, I'm going to give you about a minute to think, and then we'll have a little bit of conversation about this. What are 3 words or ideas that come to mind when you think about Japanese American incarceration? What are 2 questions that you have? And what would be a metaphor or a simile to describe your level of knowledge at this point? All right, so go ahead and take some time. I will also think, and we'll share into the set up a bit. All right, Sylvia, let's come back together and discuss a little bit about 10 seconds. All right, so Sylvia, what are 3 words or ideas that come to mind when you think of what you know about Japanese American incarceration?
About what I think. Well, first, I would definitely have to say that curiosity comes to mind, amazement, and injustice would be those 3 words for me. You also have those kind of ideas or words.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. The 3, as I was doing this exercise with you, the 3 words that came up or came to mind really quickly were sort of like the geographic distribution, legacies, right? So, like thinking about the geographic distribution of these incarceration camps, like what happened with folks after incarceration ended, and then I also wondered about reparation, like how you know how is that done? And that sort of like feeds into my 2 questions, and I'll share my 2 questions, and I'll ask you what your 2 questions are, which is I'm really curious about um, how folks created community in the middle of such a difficult time. And I'm also curious as to how families survived the aftermath of such a devastating event. What were your 2 questions?
Well, my 2 questions, the first one was, how do we not know about these incarceration camps? Because I didn't really know about them, and I think that we focus more on Jewish, part of this World War II event, which is important, but I didn't have any idea until I started, preparing myself for this event. And so my next question would be, how does it compare, if it can be compared, or if it's just an entirely different experience itself, which I'm pretty sure it was, but I would still like to see, those 2 moments in history compared.
Thank you, Sylvia. Yeah, I'm going to take a moment here and pause and talk a little about the work that the civic education series is doing and is a part of with regard to the larger work that we're doing at American History, and that is really to think about stories that have either been not included as part of a historical narrative, or forgotten, or otherwise neglected, is really what we wanted to focus on with the series. And another resource that available, as we at American History do our best to create resources for teachers, for students to use, that are not inclusive for inclusive sake, but are accurate and well researched and rigorous history. Another resource is Becoming Us. And we'll put that in the chat as well. It takes an interesting, larger, broader view of U.S. history by thinking about the importance of migration and immigration. But a lot of it has to do with what you're saying, Sylvia. It's like bringing up these stories that perhaps some folks are unfamiliar with, and it is important to focus on. All right, we're going to hold our similes or metaphors to ourselves, because there's a little bit more of a reflection for us to think about our learning process. So those we're going to hold on to. I'm not going to ask you to share that. But we're going to move on now. We started to think about Japanese American incarceration, this moment, and this is the main primary document that we're going to look at for today. And the thinking routine that we're going to engage with is one called See, Think, and Wonder. All right. So we're going to take some time here to look over this. I will read this out loud for folks who could use that as assistance. And describe it. We are looking at a letter on White House letterhead, and it reads, "The White House, Washington," and the text itself says or states, "A monetary sum and words alone cannot restore lost years or erase painful memories. Neither can they fully convey our nation's resolve to rectify injustice and to uphold rights of individuals. We can never fully right the wrongs of the past, but we can take a clear stand for justice and recognize that serious injustices were done to Japanese Americans during World War II. In enacting a law calling for restitution and offering a sincere apology, your fellow Americans have, in a very real sense, renewed their traditional commitment to the ideals of freedom, equality, and justice. You and your family have our best wishes for the future. Sincerely, I'm assuming that says George Bush. And I'm saying assuming, I know it was George H.W. Bush, Bush the Elder. But the premise of See, Think, Wonder is to encounter an artifact, an object for the first time, and pose questions to oneself and to others about it. All right. So that is the document. So I'm going to ask you, Sylvia, what are some things that you think or that you wonder or that you see with regard to this document?
Well, I would have to say that the level of apology, that it was nationwide, it was asking for. It could be a sincere apology, after years of having the incarceration stats. I would say that's the thing that stands out for me.
Yeah, one of the, if I were encountering this for the first time, right? And if, as thinking through someone that may have been in your position that you described earlier, Sylvia, that you did not know that this happened or this is an unfamiliar story to you. If I were encountering this letter for the first time on White House letterhead, I would have lots of questions. What were the injustice specifically, right? Because it's kind of it's open ended. Like we don't know what the injustices were. All we can glean from this letter and what I'd like to find out more about based on the letter is what were the injustices? What happened? In what ways, did the United States during this period and with its actions towards Japanese Americans sort of trespass or go against the ideas of freedom, equality, and justice, right? We have some clues, right? Because President Bush is calling out, hey, we did not meet up to these ideals. Injustices were done, but we don't get a clear sense, right? So I'd like to know. I'm also wondering, what is this mention of a sum, right? Like a sum of money, like, so those are the historical thinking questions, the investigative questions that I'd have, or like the wonderings I have. And then I would think that there's more to this story. I think that there has to be something to measure this against or compare it to, right? Like, which leads to another wondering is like, how did folks come up with whatever sum it is that the government is offering? Like there seems to be, I'm assuming there was a process, but what was that process, right? So those are some of the questions that I have. Those are some of the things that I think as I see this document. But I'm going to turn this over to you to share a little bit more about this particular document, to give us some more historical context over the next 5 minutes or so. So Sylvia, what do we know about this?
Okay, so the United States didn't really get involved in World War II in the beginning. It got involved in this war when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, And so it was in that time that the U.S. government issued the Executive Order 9066, which forced over 120,000 Japanese Americans into incarceration camps. And these Japanese Americans were given a 48-hour notice to basically get all of their affairs in order, And I would say that the reasoning behind the executive order was possibly fear and distrust towards Japanese Americans. I'm not saying that is right or wrong. I'm just saying that, that might have been the purpose for that. These Japanese Americans that were incarcerated, they spent 3 years living in difficult conditions, such as under armed guard and behind barbed wire. There was also no privacy or a sense of normality. They ate together at mess halls and they also used bathrooms. However, people did try to have a sense of a normal life within the confines of these camps, like attending schools and religious services as well. After those 3 years, so that would be 1944, the Japanese Americans were allowed to leave incarceration camps, but as you mentioned earlier, Orlando, trying to rebuild their lives was not easy, right? After the war, there were attempts to redress this injustice that the incarcerees went through, but many didn't want to talk about what had happened to them. However, the civil rights activism of the 1960s and the 1970s inspired younger generations to question what had happened and push for public recognition and preservation of this moment in history. So eventually, people started talking about their experiences and telling their stories of what they had gone through in these incarceration camps. Activists and organizations use a variety of strategies and tactics, such as organizing pilgrimages and days of remembrance at camp locations. They also lobbied state and federal governments to recognize the constitutional violations of the Executive Order 1966, and also to remember those who had been incarcerated. The Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, they conducted a research and heard the testimony from over 750 witnesses. And what they did was basically they told their personal stories of incarceration, and that helped galvanize a broad coalition of public support. And also, the Commission's report, which is Personal Justice Denied, they established an official record of wrongdoing by the United States government. Finally, all of these tactics, they led to the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And what this did was it acknowledged the injustice. It apologized for it too, and it provided a $20,000 cash payment to each surviving person who had been incarcerated.
Okay. Thank you, Sylvia. Those answered lots of my questions that I had based on reading the letter cold, right? If I was coming into this, I would have learned the process, the background, what were the conditions, how was the amount, what was the amount. So thank you for all of that. We're going to go back to our 3-2-1 bridge, right? Again, if we were reimagining this thinking routine as a different version of a KWL chart, what do you know, right? We did the K part at the beginning. What were our 3 questions? What were 3 words or ideas? What are 2 questions? We wrote down a simile. Now we're going to work on the W and the L version of that. So Sylvia, you and I can take about 30 seconds to think, right? We read this letter, we got some historical context, and I'm going to ask you in about 30 seconds to share what are 3 words or ideas and 2 questions that you have based on this new information that you've gotten. I will also make a note and we'll share together. Again, we'll keep our metaphor simile to ourselves. That is more of a reflection to gauge our own growth and thinking on a particular topic. But 30 seconds, we'll come back and we'll share. All right. Sylvia, if you don't mind sharing, what are 3 words or ideas that you have now after learning a little bit about Manzanar?
Well, one of those words would definitely be trauma, and also how the government tried to make up for that, with the $20,000, and if that could actually fix, if that's the right word, and sort of, I go back to that word trauma that those people went through, if something else could have been done, but the damage was too big. That would be another word for me, damaged, in the sense of trying to rebuild their lives. That would have been really and also discrimination as well.
Okay.
You know?
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So the three words I have written down are one is equity, but with a question mark, which is really sort of getting at your thoughts on like $20,000, right? Which is, and I'll get to my two questions in a second. The other word or idea that came up was community, like the importance of folks drawing on each other during their time at the camp and then afterward, to create change, to work towards justice. And the third word was persistence. Was not a short process. And then the two questions I have are, like how can we learn from the work that these activists, these community leaders engaged in to correct or repair other damages that we know is around us, right? And then getting at your question, or the thought you had about the $20,000, like how do we how do we measure that? What is owed to somebody, and this is a big conversation, right? And I have some more thoughts about that towards the end, but those are my two questions. What are two questions you have, Sylvia?
Well, the first question that I have, because it's really linked to the second question that you have, how much do you actually repair for this huge damage that you have done to our community? And also how do these people were able to, within these incarceration camps, how were they able to find that sense of normality when they try to, we'll go to school and we'll have our religious services here, so yeah, that would be how were they able to do that,
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Sylvia. All right, folks. So that is the large part of 3-2-1 bridge. The bridge portion is comparing the simile or metaphor at the beginning of the process to the end. Again, to gauge growth, to see how understanding has shifted. That is oftentimes more of a reflective practice, which is why we're not sharing ours out loud right now. But we will share one more way to get young people, or you all as participants, to think about this and how we can take this incident and really scale it out to have a more community or global perspective. So Sylvia, can you guide us through one more thinking routine?
Yes. So this is the 3 whys. It's basically 3 questions, asking why. The first one, I'm going to give you 30 seconds, Orlando, to think about it. And then 30 seconds we're going to use to go over our answers. And the first question is, why might this topic matter to me?
Okay, I think I'm ready, Sylvia, because I haven't. Full disclosure, right? I know these questions, but and in the interest of time, I will jump the 30 seconds. The reason that this should matter to me is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the quotes that is most famously attributed to him is a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Really the idea behind that being that if some injustice can be done to somebody else, it is not just possible, if not, it is inevitable that injustice will come seeking you out in some way, shape, or form at some point in time. So it should matter to us because when somebody else is facing an injustice, we need to understand that it's not an isolated event. It's oftentimes a reflection of a larger institutional or structural problem that we most likely will get caught up in at one time or another.
That's true. Yeah. And to that, I would also add that, I don't think that until we actually go through something, we don't really consider, what anyone else goes through. It could be because you're a part of a community, a specific community, or because you went through a traumatic experience as an individual. And something that maybe you never thought you would go through. But now that you have gone through, you're like, well, this does matter to me. So something should be done about this.
All right. And so the second question, right? Why might these people matter to the world around me? As I saw that up there, Sylvia, I started thinking about really the question that you asked earlier about how does this relate to others, right? When you brought up that this is not the only incidence of concentration camps or incarceration camps that we have knowledge of, but like again, why was this a solution? That's the question that I have that's related to this. I think it should matter to people around me because again, this hasn't gone away. And as we think about the world and the moment in which we live right now, we have to be wary slash notice when things like camps, structures like camps are deployed and used in current circumstances. Again, if it happened once, it can happen again. So that's one reason why I think it should matter to the people around me.
And to the world, for that matter. I mean, yeah. So that would also bring to the question. Basically, it's really answering the question too, if it should matter to the people around me, it should also matter to the world. It all connects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Sylvia, thank you very much for having a conversation with me about that No More Manzanar. I do want to wrap this up by making a note of, again, the resources that are available in the chat that lead to the fuller resources for this particular case study. There is also a webinar available in which Eden and Megan have a conversation with another staff person at NMAH, Rico Sanefuji, to talk about Manzanar. And I also need to point out that the poster No More Manzanars features Yuri Kochiyama, who is someone who you all should check out. She is, her family was actually incarcerated in Jerome, Arkansas, but then she and her family moved away. She sort of settled in Harlem and did a lot of cross-ethnic, interethnic organizing and activism, and she's an incredible person in her own right. And I'm not surprised that she's on that poster. She was one of the leaders of the first walk in the 1960s. But go find that information out on the website. Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you for everybody for being with us.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our closing session where we're going to think about taking action. Now that you've heard from all of our wonderful speakers and facilitators today, we're going to take some time to reflect together. So we started today with our keynote speaker, Ebony McKeever, who took us all the way back to ancient Greece and the beginnings of democracy, literally thousands of years ago. She also shared with us the importance of sharing not only the stories of democracy over the years and things that other people have done, but also sharing our own stories and thinking about how our own perspective situates us in the telling of history and the understanding of history. That led us into our first session with Megan and Eden, who talked to us about the AIDS Memorial Quilt and helped us think about how the stories we tell about our past shape our democracy and how our understandings of democracy change when more perspectives are added. The more perspectives we add to our understanding, the more information we have, and the more information we share with others, the more we can combat inequities and fear that perpetuate problems like national health crises. Something that's very relevant to us today, just as it was in the 80s and 90s and in many other national health crises before. In our second session, Orlando and Sylvia talked to us about the No More Manzanares campaign following the tragic history of Japanese incarceration during World War II, when activists banded together to help ensure that proper apologies and restitution were paid to the people who were incarcerated, our own citizens in our own country. And that helped us think again about how the stories we tell about our past shape our democracy, as well as about the tools that are available to us to shift, expand, and reimagine the stories of democracy in the US. So as we think about those thousands of years of history and the examples we looked at closely today from 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, I think some of the threads that come through are that there are some stories that we are all familiar with that are shared very widely, but there are many that are not. And the more we share, the more we spread awareness for the many different histories and stories around our democracy that it's continuing to change and evolve over the years, the more we can combat that fear and inequity, and the more we can be empowered to act. So with that in mind, we're going to take some time together now to talk about how small actions can lead to a big impact. We had each of our facilitators who were here with us today think about the actions they can take to shape our democracy. We're going to do a little activity with you all now, where we bring our facilitators back on screen and give them an opportunity to share their thoughts.
All right. Okay, so in order to do this, I'm gonna spin this wheel of names, and whoever it lands on, it's gonna be your turn to share how do you take action to shape our democracy. So let's see who our first speaker is gonna be. Oh. Ebony, we're going to kick off this last session with you.
I just knew it would be me. So how do I take action to shape our democracy? For me, it's really about neighborhood, local community efforts. So I try to get involved with as many organizations that align with what I want to see for the future of, again, neighborhood, community, and eventually state in our country. So there's, churches, and there are other organizations. I actually volunteer at schools just to do anything I can to shape democracy.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Next up. It's me. All right. So the thing that I wanted to share is I'm trying to think how many elections I've done this now. But I've been volunteering as an election worker for several election cycles at this point. And there are a lot of things that I love about it, but I really like how it gives me insight into how our voting system works just on a logistical level, understanding the many different pieces that need to come together and work perfectly in order to make our system work. And then it also just gives me a great opportunity to interact and help a wide range of people who are in my community that maybe I wouldn't interact with in any other way. And so I believe our producer Alex is putting some links in the chat for you, but I just wanted to share 2 resources. The first one is that you don't have to be a voting age necessarily in order to take advantage of being an election worker. Some states do allow high school students to assist in elections. So there should be a link in the chat for where you can check that. And then I also wanted to point out, like Ebony said, what's happening in your neighborhood on a local level is super important. And so there's actually a campaign called Vote 16 USA that's organized by the Generation Citizen. And this is supporting efforts to extend voting rights to 16 and 17-year-olds on the local and state level. So I encourage you to check out those 2 links if either of those appeal to you, and find out how you can get involved. All right, on to our next speaker.
Before our next speaker, am I allowed to? I didn't know I was supposed to share resources now. So can I share a couple of resources?
If you have one, go for it. Yeah.
I do. So just what I was speaking to earlier, in believing in everything starts at the community level, and we have the greatest opportunity to affect change and affect democracy when we work with our local communities and neighborhoods. And so I want to encourage all the young people, just like Megan said, you don't have to be voting age to be able to participate and affect change. So there's an organization or a website called DoSomething.org, which actually provides a list of youth-led organizations across the country that you can find to get involved with if you're interested in working at your local community level. So that's all. I didn't know. I didn't know to keep going. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. We already got that in the chat. Thank you, Alex. All right, Orlando, you are up.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ebony, and thank you Megan for sharing. So there's a couple of ways to suggest, right? One, sort of building off of what Ebony has suggested and getting involved in your community, finding like-minded organizations. One way that I get involved or am involved is through mutual aid organizations, which is really a way, for communities to support each other during times of need. I will share a couple of links in a little bit for how to find mutual aid organizations regardless of where you are in the United States. And then since I'm in DC and I believe in doing work wherever your feet are, I will also put a link in for mutual aid DC. Sort of another way to do that is to find community organizations that do the work that you are in tune with, as Ebony suggested. So like another organization that's important to our family is Food and Friends here in Washington, DC, which actually connects to the time we had on the AIDS quilt, because what Food and Friends historically did and still does, but has now expanded its services, is to deliver food for folks who were shut in. And this organization grew in the 1980s during the AIDS epidemic because there was lots of disinformation about how HIV was or was not spread. So those are, again, very tangible ways to get involved in your community. But I will say, sort of building off what Megan says, I grew up going to my community center. And I think that community centers are important hubs for young people, for adults, to know what is going on in their community, but also what is available. What are the networks that are available? What are the different interests people are organizing around? I'm a big fan of the the pin boards and pulling tags off of things. I've made some interesting friends and become involved in interesting organizations that way. So go check out your community center because it is local. So all the ideas, all the matters, the issues are going to be local. And that's where, we often think about elections at a national level or democratic processes at a national level, but community change is really where things start. And so I encourage you all to go check out your community centers. And I'll put in some mutual aid links as well.
So I'm definitely hearing a trend towards the local and the personal. So let's see what our next speaker has for us. Okay, so Eden, what would you like to share?
Well, in similar theme, on using local resources, I'm a big believer in doing your research and gathering information. And your local library is a really great resource for that. My local library is really well funded, and they connect me to local farmers markets that's going on in my area. They have a DIY center. So this spring when I was gardening, I was actually able to check out gardening tools. You can also join, I know there's this like notion that Facebook is only for old people now, but you can join interest groups on Facebook. I'm part of a Buy Nothing group, which is a community group where you can give second life to your objects. My proudest achievement is that I've actually gotten a brand new Nespresso milk frother from Buy Nothing. So again, like giving your objects a second life. And that through those methods, I've actually built a lot of allies. So when I noticed that my neighborhood don't compost, I was able to talk to my neighbors, figure out how to get people to compost in their neighborhood, how to actually get them picked up. I started a petition. It has not worked yet, but the important thing is that you don't give up, and and you continue to put in the work.
Stay strong, Eden, stay persistent, and you will make it happen step by step. Thank you so much for sharing that. And we only have one person left, but I'm going to spin the wheel anyway, just because it's fun. All right, Sylvia. Who could have predicted it? All right, how do you think about taking action to shape our democracy?
Well, I think for me, the best way would be through education. I think in the classroom, teachers do have those tools, to really not only inform their students about democracy, but also let them know that, let them see a little bit of reality, and also have them informed. And maybe you don't know every single detail about all the candidates or politicians and things like that, but encourage them to, as Eden mentioned, research. Look up what their platforms are. Do they align with your values, with your points of views, so I think that's, for me, that's the best way to do it, through teachers.
Wow, thanks so much, everyone. Not only did I get great ideas for resources and things that I'm going to go check out immediately, like whether or not my local garden store will let me check out tools. That's so cool, Eden. But I'm also definitely stealing that fun wheel so that my friends can help decide who gets to pick dinner every night. So now that we have heard from all of our facilitators, it's your turn. We want to hear from you, everyone who's joining us right now or listening later. Your opinions matter to us very much at the National Museum of American History. So if you're joining us right now, please go ahead and use the Mentimeter link on your screen. You can either scan the QR code like you did before, or go to menti.com and enter the code on screen. And let us know by voting for one or more of the options if how you are planning to take action to shape our democracy. If you don't see an option that you like, don't worry, you can just add one in the chat. I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to do that, and then we'll look at the results together. All right, the results are coming in. And Megan, I might need your help to read out what some of those are.
Yes, I'm trying to see if I can adjust the screen size so we can get, you know what, I'm going to take us off the full screen there for a second so we can see the results. So the blue column is volunteer in your community. The pink column is become an election worker. Red column is talk about issues with friends and family. Yellow is engage with your local community center or Parks and Rec department. And then the green one is be involved in your neighborhood.
Awesome. So it looks like we have a lot of people who are going to be going home and having some conversations around the dinner table tonight. Also going to be going out and exploring some of the opportunities for connection and volunteering in their communities. And these are all important ways that we can help shape our democracy moving forward.
There we go. Okay. So I think then we are going to start wrapping up. So
great. Well, thank you all so much.
Sorry, just please keep go back to all these Mentimeters. They will still be live. So even if you are not joining us right now, we still would love to hear from you. So feel free to throw your 2 cents in there when you do view this. Go ahead, Carrie.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And a special thanks to our keynote speaker, Ebony McKeever from the OER project, and to our awesome facilitators, Megan, Eden, Sylvia, and Orlando. You all were great. And we really appreciate everyone who watched live. And we look forward to many more people watching the recording after the fact. Please feel free to share with your friends. We have National Youth Summit resources linked in the chat if you would like to learn more about this year's National Youth Summit or National Youth Summit programs from past years. And we ask for your help in continuing to provide programming for you and other learners from the National Museum of American History. Please take our short survey. Your feedback will really be helpful to us as we think about what future programs look like. And with that, in Orlando's words, please do work wherever your feet are. Remember to pay attention, ask questions, and share stories. Have a wonderful day, everyone.